You should be good. Yep, you're recording.
Wonderful. Thank you, Samantha, and welcome everyone and happy Friday. It's been great to start off the day with a discussion about candy. This is the discussion we didn't know we needed, but we did. So in that vein, we're glad you're able to join us today. As you probably know, this is the next webinar in a series done in conjunction with the Digital Course Enhancement Project and designed to introduce open educational resources, which are in many ways the backbone of the project. As a reminder, the session is being recorded, and that recording and the slides will be available at coursecollections.northcarolina.edu. So far in the series, we've offered some foundational information on how to find and evaluate OER. We've explored some strategies for integrating OER into your local context and remixing, revising, and incorporating third-party materials, as well as strategies for opening up your pedagogy and centering equity and inclusivity in your open educational practices. Today, we're really excited to continue our discussion about opening up your educational practices by focusing specifically on accessibility and bridging the digital divide. To guide this discussion, we're so lucky to have two incredible presenters, Nora Burmeister and Samantha O'Connor. We couldn't ask for any better speakers, so rather than have me yammer on, I'm going to turn it over to them and let them get started introducing themselves and then talking through this really important topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Will. So just as a kind of precursor to this presentation, we're going to be covering open educational resources and the intersection of open educational resources and accessibility. We are going to be talking about the digital divide, but we're taking a broader perspective on the digital divide than is traditional. Rather than just focusing on internet access and the ability to have high-speed internet, we're also looking at the digital divide as things that place any barriers to our users or our students or our patrons accessing the content that we create. So you may hear us refer to the digital divide. We're not just talking about socioeconomic barriers. We're also talking about accessibility barriers. We're talking about financial barriers. So just to give you some context there. So we'll start off with some introductions. My name is Nora Burmeister. I am the content strategy librarian at UNC Chapel Hill Libraries, and I've been working in accessibility for probably about the last 10 years.
I'm Samantha O'Connor, and I am the Director of Library Services at Central Carolina Community College. And I've been working with OER directly for about a year now, but had been kind of dipping my toes in the waters of OER for a while before then. So it's an area of interest for me, definitely.
So starting off, just so we're all on the same page, I'm going to start with a definition of what accessibility is. Accessibility is a term that gets thrown around a lot as something that you need to be aware of and that you have to make sure that you integrate, but it's sometimes hard to pin down exactly what that means. So I'm going to start by going over some of the standards that basically define how we assess accessibility. These standards are on your screen right now. The Americans with Disabilities Act is the underlying principle that most accessibility and any anti-discrimination laws are based on. It's a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. Building on that is Section 508, which is a part of the Federal Rehabilitation Act that requires federal agencies to use information and communication technology, which is accessible to people with disabilities. And since January of 2018, Section 508 has been defined as the WCAG, which stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 level AA standard. So that is what's used as the guidelines for Section 508 to make sure that there is no discrimination against people with disabilities coming up. I've linked to the WebAIM WCAG 2.0 checklist where you can review some of those standards, and these links will be accessible when we send out the slides after the presentation. So the WCAG 2.0 AA standards are based on this acronym called POUR. I'm going to quickly go over this. This is not a presentation just about accessibility, but I do think this is important to understand. The P in POUR stands for perceivable, meaning that users have to be able to perceive what the content is. The O stands for operable, meaning that all of the interface components and navigational structures must be operable using assistive technology. The U stands for understandable, meaning that the information and operation of the interface must be predictable and understandable. And the R stands for robust, and this is the trickier one. This basically means that it is going to be able to be adapted for the future. that it is going to be able to integrate new standards, and it's going to be something that can evolve in an accessible way.
Right, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about a definition of OER, and I know that those of you who have already attended a lot of these sessions have gotten a lot of information about OER, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but really what I want to do is go over, when I'm talking about OER, what I mean, because it can be kind of vague and a lot of people are coming at it from a lot of different perspectives. So this is kind of what I mean during this presentation. So it really comes down to what the letters stand for. Open means that not only is it free to your users, but it's also licensed for reuse and adaptation. That is a really important part of it, especially when we're talking about accessibility, because that license for adaptation, basically for remixing, is what allows you to take something that's inaccessible and make it accessible. And then of course, educational, these are learning objects. They're not just something that is created and put on the internet with that Creative Commons license. It is something that you have taken and then integrated into your learning and into your teaching and learning. So it may not have been created for educational purposes, but once you use it for educational purposes, it becomes educational. And then of course, resources is pretty self-explanatory, but I really want to harp on the idea that this is not limited to specific formats. A lot of times when people think of OER, they go straight to textbooks, and obviously textbooks are a big part of it, but what I really find about OER is that it really comes into its own and allows you to engage in things like open pedagogy when you are looking beyond the textbook, when you're looking at pulling in resources in a lot of different formats and you know, interactive things and pieces that students can really kind of make their own. And that's really where OER, I think, becomes a really powerful tool. So looking beyond just that flat textbook is really important to me.
I think
so. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying I think that this is one of yours.
Oh, is it? I was thinking it was one of yours. I'm sorry. So some of the principles of OER that we kind of want to bring into this presentation are how it dovetails with accessibility. And one of the key features of OER, obviously, is that they exist in part to reduce barriers. The obvious ones in terms of financial barriers, but also barriers in terms of what students can access via the type of technology that they have available to them. So a lot of really strong OER is something that's going to be browser based. It's not going to be something that you have to download. So you're not looking for somebody with very high internet speeds or a lot of hard drive capacity to be able to interact with them. And also it reduces barriers in the sense that it really gives the instructors the room and the freedom to create things that are tailored to their students and their students' needs. And accessibility fits into that really, really perfectly, because if your students' needs are not necessarily that are dictated in part by limitations on their mobility or visual impairments or something like that, then if those OER are not accessible, then you're not doing your job of ensuring that you're breaking down those barriers. So accessibility really is a really important part of that O in OER, in that it is part of what makes it open, makes it accessible, and it makes it useful for anyone who is coming in to use it.
Okay, so we are going to go into the second part of our presentation, which is on evaluating OER. I am going to open this rubric that Samantha has created. Hopefully everyone can still see my screen.
It looks like it's loading.
Okay, working.
It's getting there. Okay, I'll just talk a little bit about how I use this rubric, and then Nora, if there's anything in particular that you want to pull out as a specific concern in accessibility or something that you think warrants an extra call out, please do so. So this is just sort of a basic rubric that I use when I'm working with faculty on selecting OER. I usually don't send this to them, although if you are faculty, this may still be useful for you, or if you're a librarian who works with faculty, you may find that it helps to bring the faculty in at this point. Usually I'll do this and then determine whether or not the piece that I'm looking at is accessible or not, and then just give them sort of my final call on that, along with any adaptations that I recommend. But I actually, based on some conversations I had with Nora, have reworked this to go into to follow those POUR guidelines. So you'll notice it's definitely heavily focuses on perceivable. There are definitely more perceivable things than there are in these other areas, but there's quite a lot under operable as well, looking at how users actually navigate through the resources. But really what this does is it kind of goes through a bunch of the different areas within those WCAG facets, and then also some other things that maybe aren't called out specifically in WCAG, but that are a really important part of ensuring that something works. There may be something where it's one facet in WCAG, and I pulled it out into 3 different ones because I found, as I was looking at things, that very little complies with all 3 of them. So I want to look at 3 different pieces of it separately. And what I have here is basically a drop-down menu that allows me to determine if it fully complies, if it doesn't comply at all, or if there's a partial compliance. And then obviously NA is going to be, if you're not looking at a video, then it doesn't matter if there are no captions, right? And where this really comes into play is that if I find something that has yeses almost across the board, but has 1 or 2 no's, and those no's are easily fixed, we're talking about OER, so we have the ability to adapt, so I can note what types of adaptations would help turn that no into a yes. If it's a partial, so for example, if we have a video that has captioning, but those captions were very obviously a speech to text situation and they're full of errors, then theoretically it complies, but it's not ideal. So I'll note that over to the side. And basically once I've gone through this whole thing, then I can make that call about whether or not something complies with accessibility guidelines and let the instructor know whether or not I recommend them to use it, or if I do recommend it, but only with certain adaptations.
So the piece about this that I want to call out, Samantha, and thank you for giving me a space to do that, is that I really like this rubric because it does group a lot of these kind of things that feel very disparate into sections that give you a deeper understanding of the purpose behind accessibility. It's not just to comply with federal guidelines. It's not just so that your college doesn't get sued by the Office of Civil Rights. There are real things that are coming into play here that are going to provide, they're going to help people overcome any obstacles that the technology might produce in its own accord. And as Samantha said, one of the best things about OER in regards to accessibility is you're not limited to just what a publisher is providing you and saying, this is how it is, take it or leave it, but you can actually rework content to make it more accessible. And I love this. This is also something that we've linked to at the end of the presentation, and it is licensed for reuse. So it is also an open educational resource that you are welcome to use.
So yeah, feel free to just make a copy of this and then do whatever you want with it. I'm happy to share it if it's useful for anybody.
So that rubric is an amazing tool, and I do recommend that you utilize it when you're evaluating any OER that you're considering for use in your course. When you are looking at different kinds of formats, we've created this slide as kind of a guide for the main things that you are going to want to pay attention to. So for text files, so this is going to be PDFs, Microsoft Word documents, even websites are often treated as text. You're going to want to pay attention to the file type. If you are using a PDF, that is largely a static document. It is not something that the user can interact with as easily in terms of if they wanted to add notes to it or if they wanted to copy paste things. I prefer a document. I prefer a Microsoft Word document because it gives the user more interaction with that document than a PDF does. And in my perspective, it's easier to build accessibility into a Word document than it is a PDF, but we'll go into that a little bit later when we talk about remediating accessibility in PDFs. You want to make sure that all of your text is screen readable, meaning that it is optical character recognized, and a screen reader can go through and read every piece of text that is on a page or on a PDF. The website, you're going to want to make sure that it is usable with keyboard navigation, and I'll give you a tool later in this presentation to check that. These text size and zooming and resizing, these are things that you need to be able to change manually as a user. So for most things, Control+ on your keyboard will zoom in to whatever content you have on your screen. But sometimes we see in databases or in embedded documents that zoom capability is taken away. So you're going to want to make sure that a user can resize the content up to 200% of its original size. Headings are really important. That goes along with that understandable piece of POUR. Headings need to be in a logical reading order. So they need to move from H1 to H2 to H3. And then if you need to go back, it should go back to H2. You don't want to jump from an H3 to an H4, or sorry, an H3 to an H5 without an H4 in between. There needs to be a logical progression and degression. Regression in the same way that you would in an outline. Tables are really tricky to make accessible. So as a general rule, I ask people to avoid them. There's a lot of markup that needs to go into tables in order to make them accessible. So if you have another option for displaying that content, I recommend using it as opposed to a table. And then you're always going to watch out for color contrast. Color contrast needs to be 4.5, I think, is it? It's on your rubric. There's a very specific ratio of contrast that you need from text to background color. So you want to make sure that you are observing that. And again, we'll give you a tool at the end of this presentation that you can use to evaluate color contrast in any web-based document. For video, we talked about some of this already. You're going to want to make sure that captions are available for that video, and you're going to want them to be closed captions, meaning there's something that the user can turn on or off as they like. Audio description is kind of the next step for video accessibility. It's not something that's required for the current AA standard, but if we move to AAA standards for WCAG, audio description is a piece that's going to be required. An audio description, if anyone's not familiar, is when playing a video, there will be a pause in which someone will describe what is happening on the screen. So not just who's saying what on the screen and what they're saying, but what they're doing, what actions are being taken, and the images that are on the screen. Think of it as alt text for videos. Transcripts are very useful for accessibility in videos because they give the user an alternative access point to the content of that video. One of the things that I love about accessibility, to digress here for a moment, is that by making things accessible, you're not only making it easier for patrons with disabilities to access that content, but you're actually opening up avenues of access for people who don't have disabilities as well. Transcripts might be really useful for someone who is doing their homework in, the family room with everyone being very loud around them, and they want to be able to just read through the content, or they want to be able to copy paste from a transcript into their notes. So just remember, accessibility is not just for disabilities, it's also a way to enhance all of your students' learning experience. Samantha touched on this slightly earlier. A lot of people use mobile devices to access content these days. That's part of the digital divide. That's part of what we talk about when we talk about being device agnostic. We want content to be usable on every browser and on every device. A lot of people aren't going to have a lot of data storage on their phone. So my preference is any content that you're providing for a student is something that can be accessed through a browser. Ideally, not a huge file so that it doesn't take forever to load for people that have low speeds of internet access, but requiring a download of something is sometimes very problematic. And then back to that keyboard functionality, the pause play function for any video player needs to be accessible using keyboard controls. I'm sure everyone's used Netflix, and when you hit spacebar, the video pauses. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about keyboard controls for video playback. Interactive media, this is something that's very popular these days, creating interactive learning objects, and I do think that they're great. But you still have to worry about accessibility. You have to, again, make sure that every piece of content on that tutorial or on that screen is accessible and reachable using keyboard navigation. You still need to make sure that it is compatible with a screen reader. that it works in multiple browsers, that you're not taking away your user's ability to zoom or resize things, and that you're still paying attention to color contrast. This one's one of my favorite slides. Sometimes things look very accessible and they're lying to you. So one of the things that I've learned just in the last year is that open captions are different than closed captions. Closed captions are the kinds of captions that you are able to turn on and off as a user. Open captions are also referred to as burned-in captions, and they are part of the video, which means that they are not able to be read by a screen reader, which means that if you have someone who is using a screen reader and trying to watch a video because of a visual impairment, those captions aren't going to be worth anything to them because they're not going to be able to see them and their screen reader isn't going to be able to read them back to them. So you want to make sure that if you are uploading a video which needs captions, that you accompany that video with an SRT file, which is something that you can get from YouTube. If you upload the video and use YouTube's captioning feature, you can then download the video and it will download both the video file and the associated caption file. This one's less common these days, but Flash-based interactives used to be a very complicated accessibility subject. Flash is something that was no longer going to be supported after December of 2020. And Flash is just generally inaccessible in that it doesn't work with keyboard controls. It's not screen readable because that Flash content is not coded into HTML. It lives elsewhere, so your users can't actually parse through it in the same way they could a web document. Images of text, this one comes up a lot when working with instructors who want to make their Blackboard or their Canvas course view more flashy, more visually appealing. So they'll create a banner with the course name and export that as an image and then import it into their course. Then you have an image that has no meaning to someone using a screen reader. It's a better bet in most cases to utilize the word processing or the text editing functions that are available for you within Canvas or Blackboard or Sakai, so that you can make sure that the content that you're creating is native to that platform and therefore is more likely to be accessible. And then this last one, assuming accessibility between formats. If you create something in Word and you make it accessible in Word and then you export it as a PDF, there's no guarantee that all that formatting will export with it. So you still want to double check it. All right, we are moving into the adaptation and creation portion of our presentation.
So one of the things, of course, that makes OER so functional for increasing and enhancing your pedagogy is because it has that ability to adapt, and because by its very nature, it can be created by you. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about licenses. I know you guys have already had a session on that. I can go deep into this rabbit hole, but I'm not going to. Basically, what you're looking for, if you find an OER that you like, but that is not accessible, you're looking for one that you have the ability to adapt. And that's pretty much standard in the Creative Commons licenses. So basically, if you find just your basic license, the BY license, that's going to allow you to adapt it, obviously. You're also going to be able to do that in a non-commercial format because you guys are all educators. So with this second level of licensing, you also have the ability to adapt because it is not for commercial purposes. It does get a little trickier once you get to this next level with share alike. Different institutions have different policies on licensing. Make sure that you have the ability to license your own materials using the same structure if you are going to be adapting something that has the share alike. Because once you've adapted it and you've applied it, then you need to be sure that you need to be certain that you can share it then to be adapted by others. If you don't have that capability as part of your institution's policies, or as part of your personal contract in terms of the materials that you create while basically performing work for hire, then you might run into a tricky situation. So just double check that before you get too deep into this. And then of course the same thing if it's a non-commercial share alike. I did not include the other type of license on here, which is of course the no derivatives license, because that is the one that you cannot adapt. If something is licensed with the ND symbol, no derivatives, then that is the one that you really can't. However, if you do come across one of those that is inaccessible that you would like to use, you should be able to reach out to the original creator and ask them, hey, is this, can you perhaps put in these accessibility standards so that I can use this, or can you give me permission to adapt in this particular situation? Depending on who the creator is, they might be very willing to do that for you. They may find that actually they meant to make it accessible and they didn't realize that it wasn't. So if you do come across one that has that no derivatives license, then that would be my suggestion, is don't just give up on it, but actually reach out to the creator. You may have some luck with that. And then of course, anything in the public domain, you have the ability to adapt as well. So there are people that will apply the public domain license, it's not really a license, but label to their Creative Commons work. But also more likely what you're going to come across are government documents or materials that are old enough to have passed into the public domain, but those you also have the ability to adapt as needed. And the next step from that, so I really think of OER is a learning process, and your first process is figuring out what the heck they are and how to find them, how to use them. The second is to adapt the ones you find to make them fit into your needs better. And then the third is creating your own. So just a few tips when you are at that point where you're creating something to be used in your class and that you want to share more widely as an OER. It's a lot easier to start from a point of accessibility and build from there than it is to retrofit accessibility to something you've already built. So take the time to think about accessibility, use that rubric as you're putting things together when you're at that starting point of building an OER for yourself. I always recommend, regardless of whether we're talking about accessibility, just in general, think about user-centered design when you're creating something. Identify your users and think about how they will actually be utilizing it, what you want them to learn from it. And that's going to kind of guide you in every aspect of the development of it, but in particular, it's really helpful for figuring out what are the accessibility challenges that I might run into with this type of document. In terms of navigation, if it's very large, if it's a textbook or something like that, figure out what that navigation map is going to look like. As Nora went into earlier, it's really important to have that sort of logical flow. If you develop that early, that makes it a lot easier to apply it rather than going back and trying to fix it later. If you're making a video, I know a lot of people like to just kind of have that natural feel of going in and talking, but unless you have very good text-to-speech captions, I recommend having a script. You may not work with it word for word, but it makes it a lot easier when you go back to write those captions. And then just a couple of tools that I wanted to point out. The first one is when you are developing something that you need to worry about color contrast with, this tool, Leonardo, is a really great place to basically go and create a palette for you. So it will both create something pretty that is also accessible in terms of its contrast. And so I really like that because I like things to look pretty. For creating accessible PDFs, obviously there are going to be a lot of different formats that you may use besides PDF, but if you are looking at flat documents, PDFs may be something that you work with a lot. So I've included a link to the WCAG guide to creating accessible PDFs. And then one that I wanted to point out, and I think we have enough time to look at this really briefly, is readability. And this is something that is not officially part of like WCAG or anything like that, but it is a really important piece of the accessibility puzzle. Because if you are creating something where it's the content that you want your students to get, not necessarily the language in how that content is presented, then you want to make sure that you are not presenting it in language that is above your users' heads. So readability, there are a number of different formulas that are used, and I've linked to this website. I know it looks terrible and it's not accessible, but it's a really useful website. So I have linked to it just as a tool to get you started. It does look at all of these different readability formulas. The one I usually focus on is the Flesch-Kincaid grade level, just because that's really clear cut. And I'm really quick going to show you how you can actually use this calculator. So Nora, if you will go into, if you'll just scroll down to the
Flush Reading Ease Calculator.
Yeah, or the free readability calculators.
Okay, yeah, I'm on the Flush one.
So while she's getting to that link, I'll just tell you a little bit about what the readability formulas all sort of do, and they all do it a little differently. But basically, they're looking at the ratio of how many words to each sentence you have and how many syllables in each word. And so in order to make it more readable, you want to use shorter sentences and smaller words. Obviously, that's not always going to be an option, but I'm going to show you really quick what that looks like.
Automatic one?
Use the automatic readability checker right there, a little bit lower. It's number 1 down here. Yeah.
Cool. Sorry, I think my screen share is lagging a little bit behind.
Oh, okay. Yeah, all right. So Nora is just going to really quickly paste in a very flowery paragraph that I wrote. Accessibility is a vital key to creating open educational resources and reducing barriers our students may face during this unprecedented shift to virtual learning environments. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused a sea change in higher education to which we have had to adjust very quickly. As we move into 2021 and close out this first year of lockdowns and pandemic-induced virtual teaching and learning, we should begin to reflect on the practices that we have adopted. Now is the time to determine what is working and what is failing, to identify those practices that should... All right, well, anyway, you get the idea. So if we look at this, I'm going to go straight down here to the Kincaid grade level. This is a graduate level paragraph. So if you were to share that with your students, chances are many of them would understand what you were saying. But keep in mind that a lot of your students are international. They're not all native English speakers. And if you were sharing it with, say, freshman students, they may not quite be at that level yet. I'm at a community college, so I actually usually aim for around an 8th to 9th grade reading level, just so that I can ensure that our older students who have been out of college or out of school for 10 years, and as well as our actual high school students who are taking community college classes, have full access to the content of what I'm trying to say. So I made some very small changes to this paragraph to make it accessibility is an important part of creating open educational resources, period. These resources reduce barriers to learning, period, etc. You get the idea. I basically am taking all these very complex sentences and breaking them down into smaller, simpler sentences. And I have taken some of my more flowery words and come up with something a little simpler to put that, to get across the same idea. And so this has taken our graduate level paragraph down to about a 6th grade level. Content is the same, but I've obviously changed the language in such a way that it's a lot more accessible. Now, obviously, 6th grade level may not be your goal either, but I just wanted to kind of get across that point that very small changes make a really big difference in readability. And when you're dealing with somebody who's not a native English speaker, somebody who is maybe new to college and isn't quite on a college reading level yet, or somebody that may have a dyslexia or some other learning disability, this is really something to think about. So obviously, if you're teaching a 400 level English course, to a certain extent, you're going to expect a higher reading level from your students. But if you're teaching, a chemistry class or something like that, it's really the content of what you're writing that's important, not so much how it's being presented. So in those situations, you really do want to make sure that that readability is at a level that's going to be accessible to the majority of your students. And this is just a good tool to kind of take your natural communication styles down a few notches, because as educators, you guys have a very good grasp of language. So.
Thank you, Samantha. I think readability is very important for usability as well, and that can be another barrier. And what we're doing with this presentation is seeking to identify and then create strategies to reduce any barriers that our students might face. So I think that absolutely fits within the accessibility, open educational resources context. I'm going to talk a little bit about remediating accessibility, which means going into something that exists and then making it accessible. PDFs are often one of the most difficult things for people to make accessible. Unfortunately, there are no free products that I've been able to identify that do this well. So I'm going to be demonstrating remediation of PDF accessibility today with a program that I use called Foxit Phantom PDF. It's not free, but there is an educational discount if you use your .edu address. And there's a bulk discount if many people at your institution want to use it. But you can do the same thing with Adobe Acrobat. So I've pulled up kind of a sample PDF, and let me know when you can see this so I know when about that lag is happening. Do you see a lorem ipsum?
There it is.
There it is.
Cool. I will try to talk slow and work ahead of myself. So this is a very standard PDF. It's got text, it's got some graphs and images, a table, it's got heading text, it's got a decorative image. One of the reasons I love Foxit is because it makes accessibility so simple. It gives me a tab here where I can run a full check, and it's going to check for a number of different things. It's going to check to make sure that the document is not image only, that it has tags. Tags are things that are going to add to the logical reading order of your PDF. It's basically XML markup that's being applied to the PDF document. So it's going to identify headers. It's going to identify different sections of text that it's going to refer to as divs. It's going to make sure that there is a text language specified, that the document has a title, and that the color contrast is appropriate. So I can hit this start checking button, and Foxit is going to do all of the hard work for me. And it's going to come back with a sidebar where it identifies issues in my document. You can see that this document doesn't have a title. So I can right click on this, click on fix, and then add a title and say this is a sample PDF. I also probably want to add an author so that people that are looking at this document understand what it is and who wrote it before they open it. It'll go through and tell you any figures that need alternative text, and then you can right click and fix those so that you can add that alt text to this table. And you would describe what's in that table, if you can type. Perfect. So you can go through this. It'll go through different tables, headers, summaries for tables, but basically an accessibility checker is a great thing. And a lot of programs have this. You can then save this PDF and upload it as an accessible PDF to whatever interface you're using. I highly recommend utilizing the accessibility checkers that are built into documents. You do have those in Office products, so you have an accessibility checker in Word, Excel, probably Access, although I've never used it. But there's a lot of push towards accessibility, so more and more we're seeing programs actually integrate this into the software itself. And these are some tools. I'm not going to go over these in depth because we are running up on the time that we wanted to allow for questions, but these are tools that I use to evaluate accessibility. The Wave Checker is my favorite. It's a browser extension that you can install in Firefox or Chrome. You might be able to see it up here on my screen, this W that says it has access to the site. This will run an accessibility check on any website that I'm on and then itemize the issues with that website. So if you're using a website that is an open educational resource, if you're using that as a text document that you're adapting from, you can run that Wave browser extension to see where the issues with accessibility are in the website that you're borrowing from before you transfer those accessibility issues to your own document. NVDA is a Windows only free screen reader. And this is the one that I found to be easiest to use, but I recommend downloading this and playing with it to get an idea of how people who are using a screen reader will interact with your document. The equivalent for Macs is going to be VoiceOver. This is built into Macs and iPhones as well. The colorblind web page filter is a really cool tool that will show you how different types of colorblindness will perceive your page. So people who have one or two different types of color blindness will perceive colors in a different way. This will put a filter on your web page to show you how those people will be perceiving your page. It can be really useful for identifying any links that won't stand out against a background, or any images that are going to look inaccurate because of color blindness. And then this link is just to the basics of keyboard and tab navigation so that you can practice utilizing not a mouse to access content online, but using keyboard navigation. A lot of times anyone that has a mobility disability that doesn't have the fine motor skills to move a mouse with the level of accuracy that's needed to click on things, they'll navigate through a page using keyboard navigation. It can be a really interesting experience to try to do on your own websites, especially if it's something that you have an understanding of, because it can be really difficult to get to the places that you know exist using the tools that your patrons with disabilities might have. So the reason why all of this matters, the whole reason we're doing this presentation, is because accessibility and OER are natural partners. Using accessible OER in your work, it ensures that students with disabilities can access your content, but it also minimizes any potential financial barriers. It also upholds the principles of universal design for learning, which I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with, aiming to reduce all barriers to access for all people, regardless of their ability or their socioeconomic level.
And what we really want to kind of get across today is that when we're talking about accessibility, we're not necessarily putting a bunch of rules that you have to follow to make your life more difficult. Instead, what we're trying to do is to get you to think about the fact that your goal is to get your content to your students. Your students are there to learn what you're there to teach them. And if there's any sort of barrier that removes them from that content, it's one more step they're going to have to take before they can learn the content. And it's going to push them back a little bit further in their ability to actually achieve and succeed at those goals that you have for them in your courses. So whether those barriers are socioeconomic and OER is a way for you to overcome those financial barriers, or if it has to do with a disability that they may have that makes it difficult for them to interact with the content that you currently have within your virtual course. Either way, what we're really trying to do is break those barriers down so that the students have that more direct access to the content itself. And so OER is obviously a sort of a hot topic within that area, but accessibility is part and parcel with that. You really cannot have true OER without the accessibility piece being part of it.
So we've created some short links for you to access the resources that we've shared throughout this presentation. Feel free to copy down these short links, but these slides will be sent out. I've been told that they're already up on the webinar page, so you're welcome to access them from there as well. As Samantha mentioned, if you're going to use her rubric, please make a copy of it rather than using the one that is there, but you should be able to do that through the Google Drive interface. Evaluation tools is a view only, but you're welcome to make a copy and add things to that list if you'd like as well. All right, that is all that we had planned for you today. So now we're going to open this up for questions, whether it's through verbal communication or chat, however you are most comfortable interacting with us.
Thank you so much. While folks are gathering their questions, I'll just say thanks. This was a really useful presentation. You hit the sort of the why, but also the how in ways that I think are going to be really powerful and useful for folks. So thank you for that. And I'll say what you just said. If people have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask them here, however you're most comfortable doing.
I will say, oh, sorry. Can I?
Just gonna, yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Samantha and I both really like sharing our expertise on these topics. So I put our emails here in case you have any questions or if you want any clarification on anything that was said during this presentation. One of my favorite things about libraries as an industry is that we share information and that we are available to each other as sources of knowledge. So please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything we can do one-on-one to assist. That's all.
Yep, I think Nora said earlier that we each have our soapboxes, and these are them. So we are more than happy to talk on this for as long as anybody would like to engage us.
Awesome. Well, I'm not seeing a lot of questions come through chats. Thank you everyone for coming. We love sharing this information. The more that we get this out into the world, the easier all our jobs become, because we are creating things that are accessible, that we can share with each other, that we can adapt for our own needs. So I'm really excited to see where OER goes. I'm really excited to see how accessibility evolves. And I think if they can evolve in conjunction, that's going to be a stronger thing across the board. Jacqueline says she's with Leonardo.
Yeah, I love that tool. I think I just like color palettes. So.
Quick question for you all. You mentioned, I think Nora, you mentioned the video with like adding captions and that type of thing, and then like taking it to the next possibility of taking it to the next step where you're describing like what's happening on the screen. Is that something that like when people are doing it, is it all like in one video, or are people like separating that into a separate
audio? That's a great question. Audio description is something that should be toggleable in the same way that captions are. That's not something that we see a lot these days. There's very few vendors that provide video that actually include audio description. The best examples that I can give are just Googling audio description and video. There's a video of Frozen where audio description is burned in, but it is a file that you can upload with a video that people should be able to toggle on and off. Unfortunately, currently video players don't recognize that as a need. So it's not something that is necessarily supported by a lot of the popular players out there.
Great, thank you.
I actually have a question as well. I've been working with a lot of faculty who are interested in open pedagogy, where they invite their students to do some of the co-creation as well. And I'm curious, if you were advising somebody who was teaching a course where their students were going to be making a lot of stuff, how would you introduce these ideas of accessibility and the practices to students? Is it like, watch this awesome presentation that you just shared with us and go from there? Are there differences in the way you would talk to students doing this in the context of a course assignment, as opposed to a faculty member making a web page or a slide deck or a book or something like that?
That's a really interesting situation. I'll be honest, I haven't really thought about it from that perspective before, but
go ahead, Samantha.
No, I'm just saying that's neat. Go ahead. You've got an excellent answer.
I think that it's difficult to do because accessibility is a complicated thing. I think if you're doing open pedagogy in a browser-based system, one of the most powerful things you could do is have your students install the wave checker and check their work as they go to identify those issues. The lovely thing about the wave checker is it's real time, it's lightweight, it lives in your browser, it'll check anything, even things that are behind a paywall, because it's checking the page that you're on. So you could have students working collaboratively in a Google Drive document, and then they could view it as a published page, run their wave checker, and then identify any issues, which I think is a really powerful way to show accessibility as you're building. And then you can review that with your students and say, okay, so what issues came up and how do we fix them? How do we make sure that this doesn't happen in the future? As Samantha said, it's so much easier to build accessibility into the process of creating something than it is to make something and then try to shoehorn accessibility in afterwards. She's heard me say this 1,000 times, but it's my favorite analogy for this. It is much easier to make blueberry muffins if you put the blueberries in the batter rather than making a muffin and then trying to jam blueberries into it.
I love that example. Thank you.
I stole it from somewhere. I can't take credit. I don't even remember where anymore. Maybe Twitter.
You need to attribute that, Nora. That's copyrighted.
Internet.
No, I'm sure there's an open license. This is open analogies, right?
I make no claims to that brilliant statement. All right. So I think we're going to go ahead and stop recording now, unless anyone has any other questions. We should send that recording to you?
That would be perfect to me and maybe Michelle as well.
Okay. All right. Samantha,
Okay.
do you mind stopping that recording? Thanks, everybody.
Stop.